The skies above Earth darkened as the massive ships of the Cruthar fleet descended, their silhouettes cutting through the atmosphere like predators hunting their prey. At first it was mistaken for a meteor shower, until the explosions began. The first strike hit New York, and in a flash, the city's iconic skyline crumbled to the ground. Towering, insectoid creatures, with gleaming armored exoskeletons and eyes that glowed a menacing red, emerged from the wreckage. They were hunters. The Cruthar had arrived. Governments around the world scrambled to react, but it was too late. The Cruthar's ships were equipped with weapons that rendered Earth's most advanced technology obsolete. Laser beams that could level entire buildings with a single shot, electromagnetic pulses that knocked out communications across continents, and gravity-defying drones that moved with terrifying precision. The world's militaries stood no chance. The Cruthar didn't need to invade. They only needed to hunt, and humanity was their prey. As chaos erupted, families fled, soldiers fought back with everything they had. But the Cruthar were too strong, too fast. In one city after another, the invaders swept through, capturing humans, tearing apart civilizations, and taking trophies as they pleased. For the Cruthar, this was a game. An ancient ritual practiced for millennia, hunting lesser species for sport. And Earth's inhabitants were nothing more than the next in a long line of animals to be hunted. In the panic, humanity's resilience started to show, but it was faint. Governments fell in hours, replaced by resistance groups trying to maintain control in isolated areas. But for every small victory, 100 lives were lost. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a slaughter. Humanity wasn't fighting for territory or resources, it was fighting for survival. A few courageous pockets of soldiers and civilians fought back, trying to push the Cruthar back, but their efforts seemed hopeless. The Cruthar were not just technologically superior, they understood fear, pain, and suffering. To them, hunting wasn't just a survival tactic. It was a sport, a ritual, and they took great pleasure in the torment of their prey. Dr. Elena Carter, a renowned scientist, watched in horror as her city was decimated. She had been in a research lab when the attack began. Her eyes locked on the screen as she watched the Cruthar's weapons fire upon her beloved city, sending waves of destruction across the skyline. Panic surged through her, but something else stirred beneath it. Anger. Anger that humanity was being treated like nothing more than a game. She was no warrior, no soldier, but she was determined to find a way to fight back. The Cruthar might have technology, but they underestimated something she knew very well: humanity's will to survive. But for now, that will seemed almost insignificant against the might of the Cruthar. They were too powerful, too well-equipped. And Earth was rapidly becoming a world where every human was a target, a piece of prey to be hunted down for sport. The fate of mankind hung in the balance, and the hunt had only just begun. The Cruthar's fleet continued its relentless assault, sweeping through nations, leaving devastation in their wake. Each strike came with a chilling message. We are the hunters. You are the prey. The humans, once proud and powerful, were now nothing more than the quarry in an alien hunting game. In the midst of the horror, the survivors gathered, uncertain of their fate, but deep within them, a spark of resistance began to flicker. As the Cruthar closed in, they had no idea that the human spirit, something far more dangerous than any technology, was just beginning to awaken. The devastation left by the Cruthar's invasion was unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. Cities that had once stood as symbols of human achievement now lay in ruin. Skyscrapers, once towering monuments to human ingenuity, were reduced to piles of rubble. The air was thick with the smoke of destruction. The Cruthar, merciless in their assault, didn't just kill, they crushed the very spirit of humankind. Earth, a planet that had once been a thriving hub of civilization, had become a playground for ruthless predators. In the wake of the destruction, the world fractured. Governments collapsed almost overnight. Global communications faltered, leaving people isolated and desperate. The sense of helplessness was palpable. Soldiers, once the elite protectors of humanity, stood frozen in disbelief as their weapons were no match for the Cruthars' advanced technology. They were not just defeated, they were humiliated. The Cruthar took what they wanted and left nothing behind but the broken remnants of a world once proud and free. Within the chaos, pockets of survivors scattered across the globe. Some retreated to the forests, others to underground bunkers, but all were united by one grim truth: Earth was no longer their own. The Cruthars' invasion wasn't about resources, it wasn't about territory, it was about the hunt. And humanity was the game. The feeling of being hunted pervaded every corner of the Earth. People no longer lived, they simply survived, waiting for the next strike, the next raid. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, not all hope was lost. Amidst the destruction, a small group of survivors began to band together. Dr. Elena Carter, who had narrowly escaped the Cruthars' initial assault, found herself in a makeshift camp deep in the woods. Surrounded by a few scattered civilians, soldiers, and scientists, she began to focus on one thing: survival. But it wasn't just survival that occupied her mind. She couldn't shake the thought that there had to be a way to fight back. As the days wore on, Elena's fear turned into something else: anger. She couldn't accept that the human race would simply roll over and die. Her mind, once focused on scientific progress, now became fixated on finding a way to turn the tide. She began to search through what little research had survived the initial attack, looking for anything that could be used against the invaders. Even if it was just a small advantage, it would be enough. But with the Cruthars' advanced technology, she knew she would need more than just hope. She needed knowledge, something the Cruthar had overlooked. The survivors around her began to feel the weight of the situation. Some had already lost their loved ones, others had barely escaped with their lives. Yet there was a shared understanding in their eyes, a silent agreement that they would not go down without a fight. They weren't soldiers, not in the traditional sense, but they were the last line of defense. Elena gathered what information she could, speaking with those who had survived Cruthar attacks and studying the wreckage of their destroyed cities. The Cruthar were relentless, but they weren't invincible. They made mistakes, small, almost imperceptible flaws in their technology. Maybe, just maybe, humanity could exploit them. As the survivors huddled around campfires, sharing stories of what had been lost, a quiet resolve settled over them. They didn't have the resources, and they didn't have the firepower to match the Cruthar, but they had something far more valuable: their determination, the will to fight, the will to survive. And as the fires burned bright in the darkness of that shattered world, the faintest glimmer of hope began to emerge. They weren't alone. Humanity had been humbled, yes, but it had not been broken. The hunt was far from over, and for the first time since the Cruthar arrived, humanity had a chance to turn the tables. Dr. Elena Carter couldn't sleep. The quiet hum of the camp was broken only by the distant sounds of the forest at night, but her mind raced. The Cruthar had wiped out so much. Entire cities, whole countries, gone in the blink of an eye. Yet the more Elena thought about the devastation, the more she became convinced of something she couldn't shake. The Cruthar weren't invincible. No matter how technologically advanced they were, there was always a flaw, and she intended to find it. For weeks, she pored over old military reports, scouring through data she had collected from the survivors. She studied the wreckage left behind by the Cruthars' assault. She had witnessed firsthand their weapons, laser beams that cut through steel and gravity-defying drones that seemed to anticipate human movement. But there was one thing that gnawed at her: the Cruthars' reliance on a specific frequency. It wasn't immediately obvious, but Elena had spotted the pattern. Every time they attacked, their technology seemed to synchronize on that frequency. The Cruthars spoke to each other using signals, just like any other species, and signals could be disrupted. She didn't share this with the others immediately. It was too risky. The survivors were all caught in their own struggles, many of them too broken to believe that anything could be done. But Elena knew better. She had once worked on communication technologies for the military, systems designed to prevent enemy interception. If she could turn their own communication system against them, there was a chance. A slim one, that they could gain an edge. The following days were filled with the hum of makeshift generators and the frantic clicking of keyboards as Elena and a few engineers worked to decode the frequency. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The Cruthar's technology was unlike anything humanity had ever seen, and every time they got closer to the signal, they risked being discovered. But Elena's determination fueled them. She couldn't afford to fail. If the Cruthar found out what they were doing, it would be over for them all. Then it happened. A breakthrough. After a long night of trial and error, Elena's eyes widened as a strange feedback loop echoed through the speakers in front of her. The signal was stable. It was a crude version of what the Cruthar used, but it was something. They had their first weapon. A signal jammer capable of disrupting Cruthar technology for a limited time. It wouldn't be permanent, but in the heat of battle, that could make all the difference. The team didn't waste any time. Elena knew that in the chaos of the Cruthar's hunts, every advantage counted. They needed to strike now, before the invaders could adapt. The first test was dangerous, taking down a Cruthar's drone. But as the device powered up, there was a crackle of interference, followed by a resounding silence. Then, to their amazement, the drone staggered mid-flight, falling to the ground with a crash. The room erupted in cheers. It wasn't much. The Cruthars still had their overwhelming firepower, their massive fleets. But for the first time since the invasion, Elena saw something else in the eyes of the survivors. Hope. A glimmer of victory that they hadn't thought possible. Within days, the resistance was ready. Armed with the jammers and a growing network of fighters, they began targeting Cruthar patrols. The first few victories were small, disabled drones, disabled weapon caches, but they sent a powerful message. The Cruthar were not untouchable. Humans were not merely prey. They could fight back. In the forests, the survivors began to regroup, formulating plans. A small team of resistance fighters, led by Elena herself, began infiltrating the outskirts of Cruthar-controlled territories. They had a simple goal: sabotage, destroy supply lines, disable their communication hubs, and if they could, capture a Cruthar weapon. But even as they moved forward, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the Cruthar were watching. The hunt had changed. Now, the humans were no longer just fleeing. They were becoming the hunters. The early victories were small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of the war, but to the survivors, they were monumental. Humanity was no longer cowering in fear. They were fighting back. Each successful mission emboldened them. Each disabled Cruthar drone, each blown-up supply convoy, was a statement. We are no longer prey. But the Cruthar weren't foolish. They had hunted across the stars for centuries, and they knew how to deal with resistance. They had tasted their first taste of vulnerability, and it had been unsettling. Harkoth, one of the Cruthar commanders who had led the initial invasion of Earth, began to sense that something was wrong. He had observed the humans closely, learning from the skirmishes and failures. He had come to a disturbing conclusion. The humans were adapting. They weren't just fighting. They were learning. They were starting to use tactics, guerrilla warfare, and subversive strategies, all with a level of ingenuity that made Harkoth uneasy. The humans were no longer just prey. They were becoming predators in their own right. The Cruthar's arrogance had initially blinded them to the threat. They had underestimated the humans, assuming that their superiority would always ensure victory. But now, with each strike back, their belief in their invincibility began to wane. The Cruthar's once perfect strategy of hunting and capturing prey was faltering. They hadn't expected their quarry to outsmart them. They hadn't expected to find a species willing to learn and adapt so quickly. Harkoth, now fully aware of the growing human resistance, decided it was time to strike back in earnest. He gathered his most elite forces, Cruthar soldiers trained for the most dangerous hunts in the galaxy. His plan was to wipe out the Resistance in one fell swoop. He would show the humans the price of defiance. They would feel the true force of the Cruthar's might. But as Tarkoth moved his forces into position, the humans were already one step ahead. Through their guerrilla tactics, the Resistance had managed to gather crucial intelligence. Elena Carter and her team of engineers had managed to intercept Cruthar communications, learning of their plans before they were even fully formed. Armed with this knowledge, the Resistance laid a trap of their own. They had studied the Cruthar's movement patterns and set up ambushes in key locations, hoping to exploit the overconfidence of the Cruthar forces. The first clash came unexpectedly, when a Cruthar patrol entered a forest where human survivors had set up a temporary base. The Cruthar were confident, their weapons gleaming and their armor practically impenetrable. But the humans had one advantage: the environment. The dense woods were perfect for ambushes, and the Resistance had set traps at every possible escape route. The humans used their knowledge of the land to their advantage, and when the Cruthar walked into the trap, they were unprepared for the intensity of the attack. The human soldiers, armed with scavenged Cruthar weapons, laid into the alien forces, taking them by surprise. They didn't just fight. They outsmarted their opponents. Elena watched from a distance, heart pounding as she observed the unfolding battle. For the first time, she saw fear in the eyes of the Cruthar. They weren't used to being outwitted. They weren't used to this. They had assumed that their superior technology and strength would guarantee their victory. But now they were learning that the humans were not so easily defeated. By the time the Cruthar realized what was happening, they were already in retreat. Their patrol, decimated by human guerrilla fighters, was forced to withdraw, leaving behind several dead and wounded Cruthar warriors. The humans had won. It was a small victory in a war that seemed endless, but it was a turning point. For the first time, the humans had successfully turned the tables. They had become the hunters. Back at the Resistance camp, the survivors celebrated their victory. But there was no time to rest. Elena knew this battle was just the beginning. Tarkoth and the Cruthar would be back, and they would come prepared. But for the first time since the invasion, Elena felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope. The Cruthar had underestimated humanity once, and they had paid for it. Now the true hunt had begun. The victory in the forest was a powerful symbol, but Elena knew it was fleeting. Tarkoth would not make the same mistake twice. The Cruthar were ruthless, relentless in their pursuit of prey. The attack on the patrol had been a victory for the Resistance, but it was just one small skirmish in a much larger war. As the humans regrouped, they knew they would face a far more formidable retaliation. Tarkoth's fury was palpable. The failure of his elite squad was an affront to his pride and his mission. He would not allow the humans to escape the consequences of their defiance. To ensure that no more such embarrassing defeats occurred, Tarkoth began to ramp up his forces. He called in reinforcements from across the galaxy, deploying more Cruthar soldiers and advanced war machines to Earth. This time, they would not just hunt, they would exterminate. The Resistance, though emboldened by their recent victory, also understood that the balance of power had shifted. The Cruthar were about to come at them with everything they had. Elena and the other leaders of the human Resistance made a difficult decision. They needed to strike first. They couldn't wait for the Cruthar to make the next move. They needed to disrupt the Cruthar's offensive before it could fully unfold. Every moment counted. In the weeks that followed, the Resistance worked tirelessly to gather resources, recruit more survivors, and refine their tactics. Elena knew they couldn't rely on the same guerrilla warfare strategies that had worked before. They needed something bigger, something more substantial. They had to make a bold move. Elena's breakthrough on the Cruthar communication frequency was now their greatest weapon. With it, they could potentially disrupt the Cruthar's coordination, turning their own systems against them. The problem was the signal jammer wasn't yet powerful enough to take down the larger Cruthar fleets, nor could they deploy it across wide areas. But Alina had an idea. If they could harness the Cruthar's own technology and amplify it, they could use their advanced weapons against them. The plan was risky. To pull it off, they would need to infiltrate one of the Cruthar's main command centers, located deep within a heavily fortified city. The city was home to a massive communications array, one that connected the Cruthar's entire operation on Earth. If they could gain access to that array, they could initiate a full-scale shutdown of Cruthar communication across the planet, throwing the invaders into chaos. Alina and her team spent days planning, studying blueprints of the city and preparing for the most daring mission of their lives. The risks were astronomical. The Cruthar had established tight security, and the area was swarming with their forces. Even with the element of surprise, they would be outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an unknown level of Cruthar retaliation. But Alina didn't see any other choice. The humans needed a decisive strike. The night before the mission, as Alina sat alone, poring over maps and calculations, a voice broke the silence. It was one of the younger resistance fighters, a former tech engineer named David. He had been part of the team that helped build the first jammers. "I think we're ready," David said quietly, his eyes filled with determination. "But, Alina, what if this doesn't work? What if we fail?" Alina paused, looking at the young man with a mixture of resolve and sadness. She understood his fear. Everyone in the resistance felt it. But failure was no longer an option. She leaned forward, speaking softly. "If we fail, David, there won't be a second chance. But if we succeed, we might just have a fighting chance to win this." David nodded, a fire lighting in his eyes. "Then let's make sure we don't fail." The next morning, the resistance moved out, disguised under the cover of night. Their target was within reach, but so were the Cruthar's watchful eyes. As they made their way toward the city, the air was thick with tension. Every step, every breath, felt like a countdown to something inevitable. They were preparing for a fight, one that could change the course of the war. Alina's heart raced as she led the group through the ruins of what had once been a bustling metropolis. They were close now, so close to the Cruthar's stronghold. But as the shadows of the city loomed ahead, a chilling realization struck her. The Cruthar were ready for them. They were no longer the ones being hunted. The hunt had truly turned. The city loomed ahead like a dark, oppressive monolith. Once a thriving hub of human progress, it was now a fortress under Cruthar control. The crumbling remains of skyscrapers stood in stark contrast to the pristine, alien architecture that the Cruthar had constructed in their wake. The air was thick with the scent of burning debris, and the streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional screech of Cruthar drones hovering overhead. Every corner, every alleyway, was a potential death trap. Alina and the resistance fighters moved through the shadows, blending into the debris and the darkened streets. Their mission was simple but perilous: infiltrate the Cruthar command center, take down the communication array, and create enough chaos to give humanity a fighting chance. If they succeeded, they could cripple the Cruthar's ability to coordinate and communicate, buying precious time for the resistance to launch a full-scale counteroffensive. If they failed, the Cruthar would know exactly where they were, and the retaliation would be swift and brutal. They had no illusions about the danger they faced. This was a suicide mission, one of many that the resistance had been forced to take in the name of survival. But the stakes had never been higher. With each passing day, the Cruthar were growing more organized, more efficient, and their hunt was becoming more deadly. Alina couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The survivors, the future of humanity, rested on the success of this mission. "Stay sharp," Alina whispered to her team as they approached the outskirts of the Cruthar stronghold. "Once we're inside, there's no going back." The team nodded silently, their faces set with grim determination. They knew the odds. The Cruthar were far superior in firepower, technology, and numbers. But they also knew the one thing that set them apart from the invaders: human ingenuity and the unbreakable will to survive. They crept closer to the command center, a towering structure that stood at the heart of the city. It was heavily guarded, with Kruthar soldiers patrolling every entrance and drones hovering like vultures above. The Resistance had studied the patrol patterns, and with the help of their signal jammer, they managed to disable several of the drones temporarily, slipping past unnoticed. It was their only chance. Once inside, they moved quickly through the darkened corridors, taking out small groups of Kruthar soldiers with surgical precision. The sound of their footsteps was muffled, drowned out by the low hum of the alien technology surrounding them. It felt like an eternity before they reached the central chamber where the communication array was housed. The massive room was lined with strange, glowing consoles and alien interfaces, a stark reminder of the invaders' overwhelming technological superiority. But Elena didn't hesitate. She knew this was the moment, the heart of the Kruthar's operation. If they could take this down, it would be the blow that disrupted everything: the communication, the coordination, the control. It would turn the tide of the war. She motioned for the team to set up explosives around the array while she worked to hack into the system. Sweat dripped down her brow as her fingers flew over the alien interface. She had studied Kruthar technology, but nothing could have prepared her for the complexity of what she was facing now. Each second felt like an eternity as she struggled to bypass the security protocols. The Kruthar were not going to make this easy. Then, the worst possible sound pierced the silence. A loud, grinding noise, followed by a shrill, echoing alarm. They had been detected. The Resistance fighters spun around, guns raised, ready to face the incoming Kruthar soldiers. The alarm blared louder, and within moments, the room was swarming with Kruthar warriors. Their massive exoskeletons glinted in the dim light as they charged toward the humans, weapons raised. The battle had begun. "Elena," David shouted, his voice strained as he fired into the oncoming wave of Kruthar. "We need to go, now." Elena's heart raced. She couldn't stop now. The explosives were set, but they were only moments away from being overwhelmed. Her fingers moved faster over the interface, bypassing the last security protocol and finally connecting to the Kruthar's communication grid. A surge of energy coursed through her as she initiated the shutdown sequence. The lights in the command center flickered, then died. The hum of the Kruthar's technology faltered, followed by a sudden, deafening silence. The Kruthar paused, confused, as their communication systems went dark. Elena didn't waste a second. She turned to the team, her voice cold and urgent. "Get out, now." The Resistance fighters fought their way through the Kruthar soldiers as they scrambled to react, but the disruption to their communication systems threw them into chaos. The Kruthar no longer knew where their forces were located, and their once coordinated attacks became frenzied and disorganized. It was chaos. It was exactly what the Resistance needed. With explosions ringing in their ears and the sounds of Kruthar roars fading behind them, the team sprinted back through the corridors, their mission a success. As they exited the building, Elena took a moment to look back. The Kruthar had been thrown into disarray, their network cut off. For the first time, they were no longer the predators. The hunt had truly shifted. The escape from the Kruthar command center had been nothing short of a miracle. The team barely made it out alive, with some of them wounded and covered in the grime of battle. But despite the chaos, despite the odds stacked against them, they had succeeded in their mission. The Kruthar's communication grid had been severed, and for the first time since their invasion, the alien forces were scrambling, their usually flawless coordination now fractured. Elena couldn't allow herself to relax, though. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. The Kruthar were ruthless, and they wouldn't remain disoriented for long. The next few days would be critical. Back at the Resistance base, Elena and her team took stock of their situation. The jammers had worked. The Kruthar were blinded, their tactical supremacy crumbling. They were no longer able to coordinate large-scale attacks, and the once overwhelming force was suddenly fractured and vulnerable. But this was just a temporary advantage. The Cruthar would adapt, just as they had before. Alina knew the resistance needed to strike while the alien forces were still off balance. "We can't wait," Alina said to the gathering of survivors around the map table. "The longer we let them recover, the harder it will be to strike again." The others nodded, their faces grim but determined. After months of hiding, evading, and surviving on the fringes, they were ready to take the fight to the heart of the Cruthar occupation. They weren't going to let the opportunity slip by. Now was the time for a counteroffensive, a real attack on the Cruthar's strategic locations. The plan was bold. Alina and her command team identified key Cruthar strongholds that had been previously untouchable. Weapons depots, military barracks, and power grids, nodes in the alien infrastructure that kept their operations running smoothly. The idea was to hit them all at once, destabilizing their power sources and preventing them from regrouping. It was a coordinated strike, one that relied on the element of surprise, and one that would test the limits of their newly acquired technology. The Cruthar forces, still disorganized from the communications blackout, were unprepared for the full scale of the Resistance's retaliation. Alina's plan was simple. If they hit hard enough and fast enough, they could force the Cruthar to retreat or at least throw them off balance long enough for the Resistance to reclaim their cities. But as the Resistance moved to execute the plan, Alina's thoughts kept returning to the Cruthar commander, Targ. She had seen his cruelty, his cold intelligence. He would learn from their earlier defeat and adapt quickly. She couldn't afford to underestimate him. No matter how much they had gained, the humans were still outnumbered, and the Cruthar's strength was far from broken. "We've been given a gift," Alina said to her team as they prepared for the first wave of the assault. "This chaos, this disruption, it's our chance. But it's not the end. It's only the beginning." The night before the assault, Alina found herself standing outside the camp, looking up at the stars. The Cruthar had come from those stars. They had taken everything from humanity. She could feel the weight of every lost life pressing down on her, but she also felt something else, something burning in her chest. Hope. The next morning, the assault began. The first wave hit the Cruthar's weapon depot, a massive complex nestled in the hills outside the city. The Resistance fighters, equipped with scavenged Cruthar weapons and their newly upgraded jammers, moved swiftly under the cover of darkness. The depot was surrounded by an array of defensive turrets, but the Resistance had learned to exploit the gaps in Cruthar's security. They neutralized the turrets with their jammers, allowing their forces to advance with minimal resistance. Within hours, the depot was engulfed in flames, its stockpiles of weapons and supplies destroyed. The Cruthar forces stationed there were thrown into disarray, struggling to respond to the unexpected assault. At the same time, another team of Resistance fighters infiltrated one of the Cruthar's military barracks. The night was thick with tension as they fought their way through Cruthar soldiers, overwhelming them in a series of quick surgical strikes. The Cruthar, still unable to communicate effectively, were easy targets. The barracks fell within hours, and the Resistance fighters managed to capture valuable Cruthar technology, tactical weapons and armor, tools that would make the next wave of strikes even more devastating. Everywhere the Resistance struck, the Cruthar's grip on Earth grew weaker. They were unable to mount a cohesive defense, their soldiers scattered and confused. It was like watching a beast thrash about, trying to regain control over a body that had been paralyzed. For the first time in the war, the humans were controlling the pace of the conflict. But as the last of the key locations fell, Alina couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling at the back of her mind. The Cruthar weren't finished yet. They were regrouping. She had heard whispers of Sarkoth's wrath and knew that his retaliation would be swift and brutal. The Cruthar weren't just going to sit back and let their empire crumble. Alina stared at the remnants of the Cruthar's strongholds burning in the distance. She knew the next phase of the war would be even more deadly than the last. But she also knew one thing for certain. Humanity was no longer just prey. The hunt had become a war. The initial victories had been sweet, and the resistance had basked in the brief moments of triumph. But as the days passed, Alina felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing ever harder on her. The Cruthar were reeling from their losses, but they were not a species prone to giving up easily. The chaos they had caused would soon be met with the full wrath of their might. The time for small strikes was over. Now it was a question of survival. Alina gathered her senior commanders in the war room. The resistance had expanded, but the enemy's retaliation was coming faster than they had anticipated. There was no time to celebrate, no time to rest. They had to act before the Cruthar could reorganize their forces. "We've rattled them," Alina began, her voice cold, but with an unmistakable edge of resolve. "But we can't get comfortable. They will retaliate. We've seen how ruthless they are. Starkoth won't allow this to stand." David, who had been at her side since the beginning, stepped forward. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were bright with the fire of someone who had seen hope for the first time in a long while. "We've bought ourselves time," he said, "but we need to keep hitting them where it hurts. Their supply lines, their command structures. If we can disrupt their leadership, we can cripple their ability to respond." Alina nodded. "Exactly. But we can't spread ourselves too thin. We need a focal point, a target that will send a message. We've learned a lot from our attacks, and now we strike at the heart of their operations. We go after Kharkov." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Kharkov, the Cruthar commander responsible for leading the invasion, was the true face of the enemy. His strategic brilliance and brutal tactics had devastated Earth, but if the resistance could eliminate him, it would break the Cruthar's resolve. The plan was simple but fraught with danger. Kharkov was heavily guarded in a high-tech facility, a heavily fortified compound deep within what used to be a major metropolis. The resistance had gathered intelligence, and they knew that taking down Kharkov would require everything they had, all their knowledge of Cruthar technology, all their military resources, and their most skilled fighters. Alina's heart pounded in her chest as she studied the plans. She could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her. If they failed, if they didn't take Kharkov out, humanity's chances of winning the war would diminish dramatically. There would be no more room for error. "We'll need to move fast and hit them hard," Alina said, her voice calm but laced with the intensity of someone about to lead their people into battle. "If we can force Kharkov into the open, we can take him down. But this won't be a typical raid. We need to draw his forces out and keep him occupied long enough for the strike team to get in. Once we've got him, we finish it." David placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're with you, Alina. You know that." The night before the operation, Alina couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small tent she commandeered as her command center. The faces of the fighters she'd led flashed through her mind. Friends, allies, those who had fallen in the early days of the war. They had all fought for something bigger than themselves, for survival, for freedom. Tomorrow, everything could change. If they were successful, the Cruthar would be broken, and humanity would be free to fight for its future. If they failed, her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door of her tent. David stepped inside, his face tired but determined. "I've got something you need to see," he said. Alina followed him to the communication station. A series of cryptic messages had appeared on the screens, transmitted through the remnants of the Cruthar communication grid. They were incomplete, scrambled, but one thing was clear. Kharkov was aware of the Resistance's movements. "Alina," David said, his voice grave, "they know we're coming. They've already begun moving their forces." It was the last thing she had wanted to hear. The Cruthar were preparing for the same assault the Resistance had been planning. Kharkov was going to make sure they didn't get close enough to strike. The situation had become even more dire. The plan was now more than just about taking down Kharkov. It was about surviving the coming storm. Then we move up the timeline, Alina said, her voice steel. We hit them now. While they're still getting ready, we don't give them the chance to prepare. We go all in. David nodded. We've got your back. The next few hours were a blur of preparation, mobilization, and final checks. Every fighter knew what was at stake. This was it. The Resistance had one shot at victory. It wasn't just a mission. It was a battle for the future of Earth. As the assault teams moved out, Alina stood on the edge of the camp, watching as the first rays of dawn began to break through the night sky. The light was faint, but to her, it felt like a new beginning. The storm was coming, but this time, they weren't going to run. They were going to fight.